Welcome to our first Donuts and Diversity session of the 2021 spring semester. I think that the last Donuts and Diversity session that we had was literally the week before campus closed down spring a year ago. When Andy Romine moderated the session on religious inclusion. And so we have been on hiatus for a while. And so now we are back. And thank you for being here for this great opportunity to discuss disability awareness with Lex Frieden. So obviously our special guest today is Lex, and rather than me introduce him, I'm going to give Bob McDonald the honor and privilege of doing that here in a couple of minutes. We have a huge thank you to Bob for bringing Lex to us today. They have a professional relationship and a friendship, and were it not for Bob knowing Lex and reaching out to the Rawls Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and offering to host this event, I don't think that we would have been able to bring Lex here to Texas Tech today. So thank you very much, Bob, for that. The format that we're going to use today for our session is a moderated conversation. So we're extremely fortunate that 3 folks from Texas Tech have volunteered to lead the discussion with Lex. They're sort of a dream team in this area. I was so thrilled when I reached out to them and invited them to participate that all of them not only agreed, but agreed immediately and enthusiastically and really wanted to be a part of this session. So our 3 conversation leaders today are Charlotte Bingham, who is the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Administration in the Equal Employment Opportunity Office. We also have Larry Philippi, who is the Managing Director of Student Disability Services, and Brian Shannon, who is the Horn Distinguished Professor, the highest faculty honor at Texas Tech in the School of Law. So following an introduction by Bob McDonald, Lex will make a presentation. And then once Lex wraps up his presentation, we will hand it over to Charlotte and let each of our conversation leaders each chat individually with Lex and speak to their particular areas of expertise. And then at the end, we'll make sure that we reserve some time for Q&A. If you have questions that you would like to ask, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom. And those questions will show up on my screen, and then I will collect them and try to pose as many of them as I can at the end of our session. Feel free to pose those questions, not just to Lex, but also to Charlotte, Larry, and Brian. And they've all agreed that they're willing and happy to answer questions as well. So with that, thank you again for being here. And I will turn it over to Bob McDonald to introduce Lex.
Thank you, Kirsten. Back in July 26, 1990, I was listening to NPR, and I heard the announcement that President George Bush had signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. The reporter went on to explain that this law was going to require businesses such as restaurants and movie theaters to make reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. Well, at the time, I was married to a woman who used a wheelchair, and she was also a physician who worked with people with severe disabilities. So I was immediately struck with the impact of how profound the change would be on American society. A group of Americans who had long been excluded from participating in everyday life would now have an opportunity to join in. The ADA was nothing short of a civil rights act for people with disabilities. Our guest speaker, Lex Frieden, worked on the Americans with Disabilities Act with his good friend, George Bush, President George Bush, number 41. He championed it through from the ideation all the way to signing it into law. Lex Frieden is originally from Alva, Oklahoma. He is a graduate of the University of Tulsa and holds a master's degree in social psychology from the University of Houston. He has also received an honorary doctorate in law from the National University of Ireland in Galway. Mr. Frieden served as executive director of the National Council on Disability from 1984 to 1988 and then was appointed as chair of the council by President George W. Bush and was confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Mr. Frieden is currently professor of biomedical informatics and professor of physical medicine and rehabilitation at the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston, and also adjunct professor of physical medicine and rehabilitation at Baylor College of Medicine, also in Houston. Professor Frieden is also the director of one of the most impactful programs for people with disabilities, the Independent Living Research Utilization Program, ILRU, at TIER Memorial Hermann Hospital in Houston. This research, training, and technical assistance program has helped countless numbers of people with disabilities and aging issues. Mr. Frieden has been engaged in the independent living movement since the early 1970s. He has published several books and papers on independent living, as well as other issues affecting people with disabilities, including education, healthcare, employment, and technology. I've had the pleasure to know Lex and his wife Joyce for several decades, back when I still had hair and his hair was blonde. I also want to wish him an early happy birthday. His birthday is tomorrow. So please join me in welcoming Professor Lex Frieden.
I'm really happy to be here with everybody today. And Bob, thank you so much for the nice introduction. You may not believe this, but I think I remember the very first time we met. I think you were with our good friend and your brother-in-law, Joe Bonke, and we were about to make a presentation, as I recall, at the MD Anderson Hospital. Might have been the University of Texas facility there on the medical center campus, but it turned out to be a great presentation. People were really moved by it, and I think it changed their behavior. And I think that's been kind of my objective throughout, is to affect people's behavior in a positive way and to help people understand how they can facilitate opportunity for people with disabilities. I have a few slides that I'd like to share with you all. I'm not going to take too much time. Kristen's given me 10 minutes, and I'll try not to go over that, but I did put together a little program that kind of gives background on the history of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if we can go through the PowerPoint, next slide, please. It's going to be a flash run through. Next slide. So the ADA was really born from a number of movements in the 1950s and 60s. You know, most of you will recognize the theme from the civil rights marches, We Shall Overcome. And then there's a photograph on this page of women meeting to begin the women's movement in the 1960s and early 1970s. And then, of course, the Vietnam War brought many people with disabilities into our society, people who had fought in the war and were injured and came back, and many of them were frustrated because they didn't really fit back in very well. Many people objected to their presence because they thought they were in an evil war, and some of the people who had disabilities tried to get back to their old jobs, and they weren't able to do so. And it was a time of protest, and actually one of the players, the very unlikely player in the history of the ADA, was Ralph Nader, the first presidential candidate who endorsed rights for people with disabilities. He was, as you know, a ardent consumer advocate, and Ralph Nader provided space in his Washington, D.C. not-for-profit organization for lawyers with disabilities to meet and work and to develop proposals related to the rights of people with disabilities. Next slide, please. So with all of that background, people with disabilities around the country began to organize themselves city by city, state by state, and then eventually through the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities nationally. And the theme of that movement was nothing about us without us, because, you know, we had been treated up until the ADA passed as sort of victims. If we went to see a doctor, the doctor didn't ask us our opinion. They told us how we were to behave. If we went to a counselor, the counselor would tell us how to behave. They wouldn't get our input and seldom ever inquired or pay attention to us if we offered our opinion. We were people to be treated, not people to be representing ourselves. And so we really had to fight. And in fact, in 1973, the Rehabilitation Act included a Title V. Many of you now are familiar with 504 and 503 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 as amended. But those titles were never really implemented from 1973 until 1977, when people with disabilities began to protest all over the country. And people in California sat in a federal office building for nearly 6 weeks, blocking entrance to the building to protest the fact that the regulations for that law had not been signed. In Houston, we shut down the roads, downtown Houston, the city streets. There were protests everywhere, probably even in Lubbock. And folks with disabilities were asking to have regulations signed. Finally, Secretary Califano signed the regulations, and the precursor to the ADA Title V went into effect in the late 1970s. Next slide. We took our protests to Washington. At some point, we decided that there needed to be a law. And the National Council on Disability was tasked with producing a report to the President and the Congress that carried out a study, nationally study, and provided recommendations for legislation. That report, called Toward Independence, was delivered to Vice President Bush, because on the day we were to take it to the president, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, and the president's calendar was canceled. 2 days later, we were able to get back on the White House calendar with the vice president, who received the report and seemed to be personally interested in it. In fact, after the so-called photo op, Vice President Bush asked us to sit down and go through the recommendations with him. He said that he and Barbara had read the report the night before, and he had questions, stating that his family had been affected with disabilities, and he wanted to do what he could to assist us. But as we left, he pointed out he was just the vice president, and he said almost prophetically, "If in the future there's anything more I can do to help you, I will." That was 1986. Next slide, please. 2 years later, virtually nothing had happened with the major recommendation that we had made to have a law protecting people with disabilities from discrimination and mandating equal opportunity. We finally got a member of the Senate, Lowell Weicker, the only independent in the Senate from Connecticut, a person with a disabled child, who would agree to introduce the bill into the Congress. And so in 1988, Lowell Weicker introduced the first version of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was based on a 13-page legislative proposal that Bob Bergdorf and I had written and included in a report called On the Threshold to Independence. That was a significant step forward. Next slide, please.
This is perhaps the most significant piece of legislation that's been introduced, which will affect the lives of people with disabilities since the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. The legislation provides protection for people with disabilities against discrimination in a broad array of social, economic, cultural activities, including housing, transportation, state and local government services, and employment. And if I listen to Lowell Weicker and Tom Harkin and Paul Simon and John Chafee and Ted Kennedy stand up in front of the public and say this will become law, I, as a citizen, have to believe that. So I'm aware that sometimes politicians are apt to say very strident kinds of future-oriented things, make promises, as it were. These weren't promises. These are people who understand disability because they're family members, because they're people with disabilities, or because they're friends of people with disabilities. And when I see members of the Congress who can identify with us at that level, I believe that destiny rings true, and it rings true in the near future.
So the ADA was introduced. A few months after that, we had a presidential election, and George Bush was elected president of the United States. President Bush stated in his first meeting with the joint session of Congress that one of his major objectives was to sign a law protecting people with disabilities from discrimination. And 2 years later, next slide, please.
And now I sign legislation which takes a sledgehammer to another wall, one which has for too many generations separated Americans with disabilities from the freedom they could glimpse but not grasp. And once again we rejoice as this barrier falls, proclaiming together, we will not accept, we will not excuse, we will not tolerate discrimination in America.
So that was a significant moment in history. Next slide, please. It's also noteworthy that following the passage and the signing of the ADA, President Bush stated that he would like to have regulations put forward within 1 year. And he did that based on our suggestions related to the fact that the first civil rights law, the 1973 Act with Title V, took 5 years to become regulated. So he mandated that his agency should provide regulations within a year. All of them did so with one exception. That was the Department of Transportation, which was working on a couple of really tricky problems, and their regulations were offered shortly after. So the law went into effect quickly. The next thing that significantly happened was that we had the Architectural, Transportation, and Communications Barriers Board set up to create standards to make the ADA rules come alive. And those standards have been updated and maintained and are very significant. Additionally, we had a huge surprise in my estimation because two women from Georgia sued the state of Georgia because they were living in an institution and they believed they should be able to live in the community. But federal funds were only available to support them and to subsidize their lives in the institution, and they wanted support outside the institution. So they sued the state of Georgia. The state of Georgia contested that. The case went to the Supreme Court, and lo and behold, the Supreme Court judged that the women should have the right to live in the community, and that should be their first option, and that the federal funds should follow them in their quest to be independent. Olmstead decision was a significant step forward for the ADA. Frankly, we had not envisioned that step, and thank goodness we had the Supreme Court there to make that judgment. Many of us were fearful that they would not go that direction. And then finally, in 2008, we had amendments to the ADA to correct a few of the issues. Courts were having a hard time determining whether people were actually eligible for protection under the ADA, particularly in certain employment cases. And the 2008 amendments clarified that, made it very clear that Congress intended for people to be fully protected and that there should be no question about the definition of disability, which we intentionally made quite broad. The ADA amendments also covered discrimination on the basis of genetic history and background, and that will prove in the future to be a very significant step forward as well. Next slide, please. I wanted to quickly look at the impact of the ADA. We've done surveys often over the last 30 years. Next slide. Clearly, people with disabilities recognize that the ADA has had a huge impact on their lives. Next slide. Our surveys indicate that the largest impact felt by people with disabilities has been in the area of accessibility to public accommodations. And that would be public and private as we look at it today. So general physical accessibility has improved immensely. Additionally, transportation has become more accessible and available, particularly to people in urban areas. And people with disabilities observe, recognize, and sense a kind of changing, more positive attitude by the public. Next slide, please. The real barriers to implementation, full implementation of the ADA, lie in the issue of employment, in the issue of healthcare access, and housing accessibility. Next slide, please. Barriers to full implementation also relate to the fact that people with disabilities are wanting to make complaints. We need more people who complain about their lack of access, or who may complain or recognize or sense discrimination. People don't generally file a complaint. And quite honestly, the U.S. Attorney's Office in various regions, including those in Texas, have been very, very, very aggressive at pursuing these cases. And the Department of Justice supports any kind of effort to implement the ADA. That has been consistent even over the prior administration, where one might think they would be lax, and they haven't been. They have been sued the city of Houston over voting rights access and won a huge suit and a judgment against the city. And now every voting place in the city of Houston is accessible to people with disabilities. And furthermore, you may go to any place to vote. You don't have to go to a certain assigned place to vote. So complaints need to be filed by people who have grievances and who have recognized discrimination in any aspect. Next slide, please. So disability discrimination didn't go away with the passage of the ADA. We know that. Next slide, please. The three areas I mentioned before, employment has been a huge one. The rate of unemployment among people with disabilities is 2 to 3 times that of the general population. The rate of economic status is much lower for people with disabilities, 2 to 1 on the poverty line. And the health status of people with disabilities is probably twice as poor as it is for people without disabilities. In other words, 13% of the population complain about unmet health needs, and nearly 30% of the population of people with disabilities can document unmet health needs. Next slide. So where do we go from here? There are challenges ahead. Next slide. We have approximately 56.7 million people with disabilities in the United States today. Next slide. Perhaps more significantly, there are 76 million baby boomers. These are people born between 1946 and 1964. We are becoming a gray society. And as people age, they acquire disabilities. Many of them don't recognize it at first. You may have a little hearing loss, vision loss, memory loss, and all of these issues occur slowly generally, and people sometimes don't regard them as disabilities, but nonetheless they are. Furthermore, this population does not want to live in nursing homes. They want to live in their own homes. And yet we do not have an infrastructure to support independent living in the community for people with disabilities from birth, for people who were disabled as a result of illness and accidents, or for people who are disabled simply as the natural result of aging. Next slide, please. So what can we do? First of all, we need to address the employment challenges. Somebody's got to come up with some creative ideas of ways to get people with disabilities into the workforce. The old, it's National Employed and Handicapped Month simply doesn't cut it. All the advertisements don't cut it. Somebody's got to go out there and do some work. Somebody has to uncover hidden systemic discrimination where it exists. There needs to be solutions to the employment problem. Actually, there's a silver lining in the COVID cloud, because many employers who rejected the idea that people with disabilities might be able to work from home now must acknowledge that nearly all their workforce can be productive at home, and it will be difficult for them not to employ people with disabilities who require remote work as an accommodation. Next slide, please. There are many opportunities to improve education for people with disabilities. People with disabilities are still at a disadvantage when they apply for a job because their education may not be up to the standard of other applicants. Next slide. Healthcare and rehabilitation need to be improved. Here's another silver lining from COVID. The telemedicine efforts that have gone into treating people during COVID can be applied directly to people with disabilities who may not before have been able to travel to a clinic or to a doctor. And these will be important in the future. Also, the development of robotics and assistive technology need to move forward at a rapid pace, and that technology needs to be transferred to the benefit of people with disabilities. We've also already seen some of that with the Alexa model and many of the remote communications that have been recently developed, and that should occur at a faster rate. Next slide. Personal assistance. I mentioned the fact we don't have an infrastructure built for our communities where people can call for help when they need it, where people can schedule assistance in the morning, getting dressed, or in the evening, going to bed, or help with meals or anything of that nature. That kind of support service needs to be systematized in order for people to live in the community as opposed to some kind of facility where they receive that care in the context of segregated housing. Next slide. We need to update and enforce all of the standards that deal with disability because the environment is changing faster than the standards. I mentioned 76 million baby boomers who are now competing for the few disabled parking slots that you have. And that means the number of disabled parking spots needs to be expanded proportionally. Next slide. Finally, we are becoming more and more dependent on the virtual world, on the internet, and we need to update the rules that pertain to access for people with disabilities there. It's a big issue. Apps are being developed daily, almost hourly, and very few of those apps have appropriate accommodations, despite the work of W3C and despite some of the signals from the Department of Justice. Next slide. So what are challenges of the future? Right now, Uber, one of the fastest growing service companies in America, blatantly discriminates against people with disabilities. If you are blind, if you have a dog guide, if you have a cane, if you are waiting on the curb for an Uber driver that you have called on the app, and that driver sees you standing by the curb with an animal, they will pass you 9 times out of 10. We've done studies, we've watched that, we've had observations, and people with disabilities are passed daily and hourly by Uber drivers. And there's no option for people who have wheelchairs, because the drivers certainly won't take the time to fold a folding chair and deploy it in their trunk or the back seat. And if they have a power chair, they don't have vehicles available to accommodate them. And Uber says it is not their responsibility. All they are is an app. Well, the courts in England have disagreed with that, and the courts in California may soon make a judgment about that that reverses the one they made earlier. We need to keep up with that. We need to realize that this company and others like them are discriminating in order to profit. And we have to be included. We have to be full participants. Next slide. So if you have any questions about the ADA, I encourage you to call this number, 1-800-949-4232. 800-949-4232. That's the ADA Technical Assistance Line. That line is available anywhere in the United States. If it's outside their answer line hours, you can leave a message there and they generally return it the next day. The ADA Center for Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana is located in our offices here in Houston. And we have several fine attorneys and paralegal folks who can answer questions about the other ADA and other disability related laws. And actually our newest hire is a graduate of Texas Tech University. So we're glad to have Alexia on our staff. I want to thank you all for giving me the time here today. And I'm looking forward to interacting with your colleagues. And I welcome any messages you may have via email. I'm online, Lex Frieden at uth.tmc.edu. Thanks very much, Kristen.
Kristen, this is Charlotte Bingham. I guess I'm supposed to pick up here. Lex, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to visit with us. This, I think all of us can agree about the impact of this statute. And I'm an attorney, just for your background. I've been practicing law in the state of Texas for 34 years. I'm board certified in labor and employment law. And so most of my work has been in the employment law arena and dealing with employment issues rather than some of the other areas of the ADA. And interestingly, the things that you brought up in your talk actually touched on some of the things that I wanted to ask you about. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about was that did you, in the context of employment, did you have any goals in mind, and how successful do you think the ADA has been at achieving those goals in terms of employment? And I saw just from your chart that employment is one of the areas in which you have had the least amount of success. So what can you say about that? Has there been any success?
Yes, there has been success, but I will say we were very, very naive when we were working on the ADA. It was our assumption, poor assumption, that when we leveled the playing field, when people with disabilities could get into the employment office, when people with disabilities had the power of the ADA to get reasonable accommodations they might require in the workplace, that sooner than later they would begin to filter into all of commerce, and and we knew there would be a lag time because people with disabilities at that time in 1990 were undereducated compared to the general population. So, on a one-to-one comparison for any employer, the likelihood that the person without a disability had a better education and more training was actually very high. We knew it would take a while for the educational institutions to bring people with disabilities up to speed because we had been discriminated against in education as well. When I tried to get into college after I broke my neck in 1967, I was turned down by a major university in the Southwest. They told me it is our policy not to accept students with disabilities. Many people with disabilities were refused admission. A woman called me in 1985 from Dallas who was trying to get into school at SMU, and she had epilepsy, and she was refused admission from Southern Methodist University because she had epilepsy. I mean, these are the way people were treated before the ADA. After that, schools kind of got with it, but we knew it would take a while for the population to catch up, maybe 10 years, maybe 15. But here we are 30 years later, and the rate of unemployment of people with disabilities is nearly equivalent to that it was in 1990. It's a mystery, really.
Wow, that's really disappointing to hear. I will tell you that a large part of what I end up doing is, first of all, my office is the Office of Equal Opportunity for the entire Texas Tech University system. So all we interact with employees who have complaints. And before I was at Texas Tech, I was in private practice for years. But I will tell you that I feel like a lot of what I have to do is educate employers. Because even as you said, with the ADA in place for 30 years, employers do not understand the preconceptions that they bring to the table. You bring up epilepsy, which is such a good example of people who, the second they find out that somebody has epilepsy, want to say, well, they can't do this job. And I find that I have to do a lot of saying, you can't assume that they can't do this job. Someone else could have a heart attack, just as easily as someone might have a seizure. So I feel like it's the lawyers have a big part in trying to move the employers forward. But it is very disappointing to hear that there's really been no progress in that employment front. I had a couple of other things I just wanted to ask you about, because one of the things that you were talking about is basically even once somebody who has a disability gets employed, what you're seeing is that they don't have mobility within the job that they get. Is that one of the issues?
Well, clearly that's an issue. I mean, there's the glass ceiling affects people with disabilities like it does women.
Yes.
And other minorities. That's true, but that's not been our major concern at this point. And frankly, people with disabilities, we have a lot of anecdotal reports that people with disabilities who are on the job working in a company and find the opportunity to move upward actually gain that opportunity. And it's like once they're on the job and they prove themselves, then the employer's not afraid of them, and they're not likely to be discriminated against so much after that. What really concerns me is the kind of undercurrent of subtle, unspoken discrimination. if you listen to the CEOs of the companies, they're very proud to talk about their approach to diversity and how that includes people with disabilities. But if you actually go down to the level of the individual hiring manager, you run into some subtle discrimination, unspoken discrimination. They know better than to tell somebody, we're not hiring you because you have a disability. But 9 times out of 10, when they have the opportunity to hire somebody who is maybe not quite equally qualified, but close to the person with a disability, they'll choose the latter.
Okay. Well, I do know that, one of the issues that employers really struggle with, particularly when they have employees that become disabled after they're already employed, is the accommodation process. Do you have any suggestions for employers about how to, say best practices with regard to the whole interactive process that they need to engage in with their employees?
Well, as you know, the provision of reasonable accommodations is a one-by-one activity. You can't just make an overall statement or judgment about that. Employers need to be able to communicate with their employees, and sometimes people have difficulty for one reason or another communicating with a person with a certain kind of disability. It's a social psychological issue in many respects. But the people with disabilities need not to fear that. They need to be able to go to the EEOC and make a claim and have that claim reviewed. And I'm, most employers, when they hear the EEOC is coming, they get real anxious to solve that problem in a constructive way. The other thing that I think employers need to do more, and that is to consult the ADA technical assistance line. We provide a lot of advice to employers that keep them from getting sued, because we can tell them how, in a practical way, to solve some of these problems. If you're a small business, you're not required to put an elevator on the second floor because the office you were going to fill with that person happens to be on the second floor. All you have to do is move that office to the first floor. I mean, there's relatively little expense to that. And yet many employers will say, oh, we can't possibly make this accommodation. We can't afford to put in an elevator. You be a little thoughtful to solve some of these problems.
I have to agree with you because, even when I'm talking to supervisors and things that, a lot of times the first thing they'll say is, well, we can't do that. And my question is, why not? And when you actually get them to sit down and think about why can't they do that, or you say, hey, let's be creative about this. What can we do? I actually find that most of them rise to that, but you have to. It doesn't come naturally. It is somebody has to tell them, you do better than this. And so, and you really did, what you just said was the answer to my next question, which is, what are some of the ways that you may have seen innovative accommodations being implemented? But I love that, your advice is to go to the ADA technical assistance people. I think that is, for everybody listening, an outstanding suggestion. And I know that there are others who want to visit with you. So I really appreciate the opportunity of talking to you. And I cannot thank you enough for all of the work that you have done in the past the past years on this matter. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, Lex, this is Larry Philippi. I first want to echo what Charlotte said and thank you for all the work you've done. I've had the fortunate experience of hearing you speak a few years back when you were the keynote speaker at the Head in Texas State Conference. And so it's a pleasure to be able to hear you present again. In the interest of time, I really just have one main question, but it's one I think you can spend a little bit of time addressing. But um, in your presentation, Lex, there was a picture of a young lady in a wheelchair, and it was very moving to me to see her. She was holding up the sign that said, "Fix the system, not me." And I think that's one thing that we have really focused on a lot in trying to enforce the ADA and the idea of equal access, equality. But as a professional in the field of higher education and disabilities, I'm often hearing the term compliant used as a way to describe the efficacy of our programs. Can you discuss a little bit about why compliant does not necessarily mean equal as it was intended under the ADA, especially when it comes to providing quality services to our students, and then why it's important to understand the difference?
Well, I mean, as you know, Larry, by the way, I remember meeting you in Austin at that conference, and I thank you, by the way, for helping us with a few surveys we've done in Texas by connecting us to your colleagues, and that's been very, very good relationship there. But your question is a complicated question because compliance in many ways goes hand in hand with actually meeting the requirements of the law. Obviously, there needs to be compliance. You wonder why you ever get to that point and why it focuses on the point. And I'm going to give you an example of how compliance actually gets in the way of good, real compliance. And that is, we used to have in our facility a beautiful bathroom. It was a men's bathroom, a public bathroom for men. And the bathroom had huge stalls. Quite naturally, there was a lot of space in the bathroom. So the architects and designers used that space to make very comfortable stalls for people to go into and use the toilet. The stalls may have been, 5-6 feet wide and plenty of room to turn a wheelchair around. And then along comes these standards associated with the ADA. And the company has to go through their facilities with a checklist to make sure everything meets the standards, the compliance standards. So they go into the bathroom and they measure the stall. And the stall doesn't match the standards. It's 6 feet and the standards say 48 inches. So what do? They remodel the bathroom. They make those wonderful stalls so small that you now have to jiggle and jive and go back and forth in order to turn around and get where you need to be. I mean, that's a patent example of how we kind of go overboard on the compliance side when we stop to think about what the intent is. We would do much better. Nobody has ever said that you may not exceed the minimum standards. Now architects and designers are all fixated on the minimum standard.
Right.
So this is created over and over again, and I can share with you many examples, and as you think about it, you can probably point out a few as well, where the minimum standards and the focus on compliance has actually produced barriers that didn't need to be there for people with disabilities. And I hear under your question the desire for people to try and meet the vision of full participation, full accessibility for people with disabilities. And the sign that you mentioned, fix the system. Clearly, if our environment was designed to accommodate everyone, we would not need to have standards because everyone would be naturally accommodated. And I think some of us continue to work in that direction. Unfortunately, because the courts require some kind of references, these standards take precedence too often. And I can comment further, but I think the point is made by simply saying the objective here of the ADA, if you listen to the framers of the law, if you listen to Senator Harkin and Senator Weicker and Steve Bartlett from Texas and others, they will tell you the intent was to enable people with disabilities to participate freely in our society and to do everything anyone else might do, and not to have the environment as a barrier, not to have attitudes as a barrier. And I think by being preoccupied with these standards and with the concept of compliance, we have sort of drifted away from those original visions. What would you say, Larry?
Right. Well, and I agree. And, you know, your example of the restrooms is one I had in mind as well, you know, about the idea that when we were recently in a design meeting for a building, there was a larger restroom that had 4 to 5 stalls in it. And one of them had been specifically designated as the ADA stall, if you will. And my question was, why can't we make all of them, you know, where they're accessible? Because yes, one is, and that is compliant, but there's certainly nothing equal about that. If a person utilizing a wheelchair goes into that restroom, they have one option. Anyone else has 6 options. So, you know, trying to make them understand it, you know, you've got to look beyond just, yes, I realize that cost is a factor, but being compliant is not being equal. You know, we have the same issues with our students that are trying to get into buildings, academic buildings across campus, and our wheelchair users, you know, when they get up to a building, we have at least one entrance in each building that has a full ramp and an electric switch and everything, but most have one. And so when that student's trying to get into the building, if they're in a hurry, they don't have the equal access as everyone else does. It's compliant. They can get in that one door, but it certainly isn't equal. So that's kind of my focus, I guess, is, you know, as the campus ADA coordinator, those are the kind of things I look at, is doing the right thing, the universal design concept of making all of it functional for everybody all of the time. So I appreciate your concept on that and your feedback. So in the interest of time, I'm going to send this over to Brian Shannon and let him kind of pick up from there so that we can hear his questions.
Hi, Lex. This is, as Larry said, Brian Shannon. Just very delighted to be with you. Having my brother, who's since passed away, who grappled with serious mental illness, and a daughter with a physical disability that was quite rare, is quite rare. You've been a hero with all of the work that you've done and have impacted so many lives in a great way. So I just appreciate you being with us. I want to build on with my first question, something that Larry had mentioned in part of your response about the ADA and the implementing regs really being minimum standards. They're critically important standards, but as you discussed, they're a minimum. How can we as a university community, and then for the School of Business students who will go out into the business world after they get their degrees from Texas Tech, how do we go the extra mile, particularly in the university area, to be more welcoming, accepting, inclusive for students, faculty, and staff with not just physical, but also mental disabilities?
Well, it's a multi-part issue you've raised, Brian, and thank you for that. One important aspect of the discussion that you've drifted into has to do with the definition of disability. And I think the examples that Larry and I talked about were focused on physical impairments, and many people think in terms of people with physical disabilities and, to a certain extent, communications-oriented disabilities and so on. But clearly the ADA was intended to protect people with all disabilities, and that includes people with cognitive impairments, with psychiatric impairments, and mental disabilities, generally speaking. It includes protection for people with learning disabilities and and developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and on and on. And I think sometimes we disregard that in our discussions about ADA and in our training. And it's true that some people have actually graduated from college with disabilities and don't realize that they have been that they are protected when they go to seek employment. We have the issue right now. It's a big issue, and that is that the companies are being asked to provide data about the number of people with disabilities who are in their workplace. And yet many people with disabilities choose, and I believe for valid reasons sometimes, not to reveal that they have a disability. These are issues that we need to address, and they should not be issues for people a decade from now. But somehow we've got to get over this fear of revealing our disabilities. And the only way we can get over that is to show that there will be no negative repercussions should we do so. And I can give you several examples of cases in which there have been negative repercussions. And therefore, I would say I'm sympathetic to people who choose not to reveal their disabilities. But until we're able to do that, we will never know how many people with disabilities are employed by a company. Now, the good side of that is if they are getting pressure from the Department of Justice, from the EEOC, or from other authorities to meet employment targets for people with disabilities, then they may have more than they need. And I have no objection to that when you stop and consider how this counting results in trying to reach a minimum objective rather than an aspiration. We wind up with more people in the workplace with disabilities. So good on that. But to address your question more directly, I think it's important for the universities to teach people, all people, including people with disabilities, that they have employment rights and that the employers should not discriminate, and that if they themselves are and do become employers, they have an obligation and that they can be much more creative than employers have been to date. And I think we do things that don't make sense to me. Employers will hire a consultant to come in and look at all of their jobs and identify those jobs that could be done by a person with a disability. And I think that's outrageous, because in my opinion, any job can be done by a person with a disability if they receive accommodation. And furthermore, when we talk about people with disabilities, we're talking about a broad range of people with disabilities. So it may be that a person who is quadriplegic, as I am, cannot work in a tire shop and change tires on a vehicle. But another person with a different kind of disability may be able to do that, much more efficiently than a person who doesn't have a disability. Take, for example, a person with a hearing impairment working in a high noise environment. Some studies have shown that people with hearing impairments can be much more efficient in the workplace in that environment than a person who is constantly distracted by the noise. And we've seen other recent examples of people with high degrees of autism who are able to do complex tasks much more efficiently and effectively than people without autism. And so, until we begin to open up as employers our concept of what disability is, until we begin to get away from the idea that we should identify those jobs that can be done by a person with a disability and target a certain disability type to do that job. Until we get away from that, we're going to have a hard time meeting any kind of expectations as far as full inclusion of people with disabilities in the workplace.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more. I think I over-prepared with some of the questions that the list of questions I sent you early, but I want to ask one that's similar to something that Dean Williams had put into the Q&A box. So some years ago when our daughter was young, there was a golfer named Casey Martin who was on a national championship team at Stanford, and the NCAA let him use a golf cart as a reasonable accommodation for his disability. However, when he went to the qualifying school to try and become a professional, the PGA refused and would not provide that accommodation. Well, he won in court, and ultimately the PGA took it to the US Supreme Court, and we got interested because our daughter has the same rare disability, and so I had the privilege of being involved in the litigation, and we filed briefs at the Supreme Court and went to the oral arguments. And something that struck me at the oral argument that you won't see in the opinion, but during the oral arguments, Senator Bob Dole, who was then the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Tom Harkin, a Democrat, and Representative Steny Hoyer, a Democrat from the House, now the House Majority Leader, those three leaders from differing political backgrounds sat together in the Supreme Court next to Casey Martin and his family. And you have to know the justices saw that too. And it was just a poignant reminder for me that what you accomplished and all those who advocated for the ADA in 1990, it was a truly bipartisan piece of legislation, as was the 2008 ADA Amendments Act. So what was the secret sauce? How did you come about working through that bipartisan approach and having that kind of success?
Well, it's a great question, and it gives me the opportunity, Brian, to kind of reveal some of the thinking that went behind the strategy that started back in the early 1980s. The ADA clearly was based on a history of preparation. And throughout the 1970s, from time to time, people with disabilities, leadership in the disability community would say, we need to amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Interestingly enough, and those of you who are legal historians will know, that the original proposal for the Civil Rights Act included a definition of coverage that would have included people with disabilities. That was left out. Later on, two senators actually made proposals and actually introduced amendments to the Civil Rights Act, which never got through committee, but they introduced the amendment to include people with disabilities. That was in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So we in the disability community continued to argue that the Civil Rights Act should include protection for people with disabilities. But at that time, the civil rights community, and actually even through the 1980s, the NAACP and the other civil rights groups argued that people with disabilities, the definition of disability, and the types of remedies to respond to discrimination on the part of disabilities were far unlike those of remedies and definitions related to race and gender. So we have then to make the decision that we should go for a Civil Rights Act, a freestanding Civil Rights Act, rather than try to fight an uphill battle to amend the Civil Rights Act, as it were. And the first thought we had was, who will our allies be? And we liked the Democrats because the Democrats would talk to us. Jimmy Carter talked to us. Jimmy Carter was a quiet advocate for people with disabilities. Joe Califano, Democratic leader, signed the regulations to Title V. And Mondale, the senator from, I think, Missouri, was a candidate for president, and Senator Mondale, who himself had a disability and revealed that in the presidential campaign, argued on behalf of people with disabilities and made that part of his platform. Well, Mondale, as you may recall, was beaten badly by President Reagan, who had no relationship or history with disability, and in fact, it instructed George Bush, the vice president, to clean up and reduce all the regulations, and Bush took on the regulations that related to the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. Well, that was a major breakthrough in terms of the ADA, interestingly enough, because when those regulations were attacked by the Republicans, parents of children with disabilities literally went off the rails. The White House received more comments. The vice president received more comments from people in the United States about the attack on those regulations than ever before had occurred. And that was a wake-up call to the Republicans, to President Reagan, and certainly to Vice President Bush. A wake-up call that there was a group of people in the United States that could be organized to represent people with disabilities. And those of us with disabilities recognized it as well. Here was a kind of a hidden resource in these outspoken parents of kids with disabilities. So at that point, some of us believed that we could actually carry on a conversation with Reagan, and Reagan actually hired me. Reagan's personnel director reached out to me and asked me if I would be the director of the National Council on the Handicapped, as it was called at that time. I had been a delegate for Mondale at a state convention, and they did not realize that, and they did not ask me if I had been a delegate for the competing party, and I agreed to do the job. And well, on the day that I was supposed to be named by the president, I got a call from the Office of Presidential Personnel, and the director said, "There, we've learned that you were a Mondale delegate, and why would you think that the president would appoint you to this job when you were working against him in the campaign?" And I said, frankly, it never occurred to me. That was 2 years ago, and nobody asked me in the interview process if I had been a delegate for another candidate or anything else. They asked me if I supported the president, and my answer at that time was, I have no reason not to support the president. And so the guy said to me, "Look, you've got about an hour to get some recommendation from a bona fide Republican source that will vouch for you, or your appointment is in the trash here." And so what do you do? I mean, I was 24 years old, 25 years old, and the White House is telling me I've got an hour to get a recommendation. I caught my breath and I thought, who do I know that might be a bona fide Republican? And I was living in a kind of a halfway house with other people with disabilities, and there was a woman who came in as a volunteer to make the beds in our facility, and she was the wife of the owner of Channel 13 here, the television channel in Houston. And I thought, well, if there was ever a bona fide Republican, it got to be the owner of a television station. So I called Mr. Walbridge's office, and I said, "Could I speak to Mr. Walbridge?" And the secretary said, "Who are you?" I said, "My name is Lex Frieden, and his wife makes my bed. And she was a little taken back about that. And she said, may I say why you're calling? And I said, yes. I said, the White House wants me to talk to a bona fide Republican. And I thought Mr. Walbridge might be one. And she said, judging by the mail he receives, you've certainly called the right number. I'll tell Mr. Walbridge about your call. And she said, what would you like me to tell him? And I said, well, I'd be glad to talk to him, but the main objective is for him to call the president within the next hour and let him know that I'm a good citizen, that I'm a loyal American, and that I'm not likely to interfere with anybody's politics, that I will do my job if I'm appointed to it. So without speaking to me, Willard Walbridge called the president of the United States and said, I've got a friend down here who you are considering for a job. And according to my wife, who is the best judge of character I know, she married me, this man should be eligible for that job and you should appoint him. Well, about 10 minutes later, and I did not know this call had occurred, about 10 minutes later, my secretary said the White House is on the line again. I answered the phone and I looked at my watch and I thought, good grief, I've got 40 more minutes. Why are they calling me now? And the head of the Office of Presidential Personnel said to me, well, he said, I don't know how you do that. That's never happened to me before. And I said, I'm sorry, what? He said, well, a man from Houston called the president and the president called me and said, get on with it. You're holding things up. Get this man in the office that I want to appoint him to. And I said to the guy in presidential personnel, do you have any idea what Mr. Walbridge said to the president? And he's told me, he said, the president said, there's never been a good Republican in Texas who wasn't first a good Democrat. So that's how I became the, you didn't expect that answer, did you, Brian?
I did not, but I love that. That's amazing. Gosh.
So we made friends with the Republicans. George Bush was clearly on our side when we took the proposal to him. We got an independent in the Senate to introduce our bill. We knew that the Democrats would come along with us. I mean, they had to, and we figured if we got over the biggest hoop first, the rest of them would fall in line. The biggest holdup we had after the ball was rolling, after we had a majority of the members of the Senate on board, after we had the leadership of the House on board, even after we had been through 14 committee hearings in the Congress, the biggest hurdle we had, there were two of them. One of them was the Civil Rights Committee in the House, led by Jack Brooks from Beaumont, Texas. And Brooks was against the ADA because he was a fan of the Civil Rights Act, and the civil rights community was still warding him off the ADA bill. They didn't want to conflict with the Civil Rights Act. And I went to meet Jack Brooks and I told him, look, Congressman, you're going to hurt a lot of people with disabilities if you don't take your committee through this process and approve this. And I said, I believe we have a majority of the committee members who will vote, but each one of them have told us that you're the leader of the committee and they will vote however you decide. And I said, is there anything that I can do to convince you to support this bill? And Congressman Brooks said, well, he said, you pretty well convinced me. Thank you for coming here, but I'm running in a tough campaign in Texas, in East Texas. And he said, do you think you might be able to arrange for me to hold maybe a baby with a disability and have my picture taken if I support this? And I said, Mr. Brooks, we'll have the street filled with mothers and babies with disabilities down in Beaumont, if that's what you'd like, sir. And he laughed and said, well, we'll see what happens tomorrow in the committee. Well, there was still objection by the Republicans and a few Democrats in the committee. And they actually, the lobbyists all who were fighting us all thought this might be the Waterloo, the stopping point. And so the debate was going on. And at some point, the bell rang for the members of Congress to leave the committee and go to the floor for a vote. And Brooks said at that point, Sergeant at Arms, he called the Sergeant at Arms. He said, lock the door. No one is leaving this room until this vote passes. And those members who were trying to escape the vote and trying to stall the vote were locked in the room, and the congressman got his wishes, and the bill went through that committee. And the next stopping point then, and the last one, the very last one, was the small business community was fighting nose to nose to stop the bill. And I frankly don't understand why, because we already had made compromises in the bill to allow businesses with fewer than, I don't know at the time, 18 employees or something like that, basically to be exempt from most of the bill. So I learned in this process that small business is a misnomer, that many small businesses literally have hundreds of employees, and those were the ones who were fighting us. That led then to the Capitol Steps rally, where more than 100 people with disabilities took themselves out of wheelchairs and pulled themselves up the steps of the Capitol, and that got national attention. And the ADA was passed by the Congress 2 weeks later and signed by the president 2 weeks after that. So there were hurdles. It wasn't as easy as it might seem, but as far as the politics were concerned, we were able, based on the people's personal interest in disability, to get that bill through pretty much intact.
Lex, thank you. That's just terrific. As a political junkie myself, it's wonderful to hear how the sausage was made, and we're so glad it was made. I see I'm up against my time slot, so I'm going to kick things back over to Kirsten to take us home here.
Thank you so much, Lex, for the wonderful stories. I mean, those are insights into these issues that we couldn't possibly get anywhere else, and it's just wonderful to hear those stories. We are at time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So if you need to leave, that's totally okay. Thank you so much for being here. And, of course, thank you to Lex, to Charlotte, to Larry, and to Brian for the roles that they play today, and for helping us to have this conversation about disability awareness. But I did promise that we would have some Q&A, and we do have a couple of questions in chat. So if you're able to stick around, I would like to at least pose these couple of questions to Lex and give him an opportunity to respond for the folks that have been waiting patiently to have their questions answered, if that's okay with you, Lex.
That's fine with me. I really appreciate Charlotte, Brian, and Bob and Larry. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to these questions, Kristen.
Well, the first one, just piggybacking off of the stories that you just told, and Brian's last question, as he alluded to in the conversation, comes from our Dean, Margaret Williams, here in the Rawls College of Business. And just sort of thinking about how, back when you were going through this process with the ADA, politics was a little less polarized than it is today. Do you think that you could potentially have the same success in getting more conservative politicians to support legislation today that would place additional restrictions on business, or do you think that we're too polarized in order to make that happen?
Well, that's a good question, and it's obviously hypothetical. The disability community leadership today would be averse to making any proposals to this Congress. And the reason is, and not that they would be fearful that the bill that might be put forward would be debated, but they would be fearful that it might be twisted by conservatives, frankly, on either side of the aisle. And that's the real risk when you put a bill before the Congress, and in fact, if it's an amendment, you're opening up the original bill. And we've had some real tricky issues to deal with. You may remember 2 years ago, a congressman from Houston introduced a bill that would have literally gutted the ADA, and that bill got quite a bit of support from conservatives, mostly on the Republican side, who were being pushed by business. And business, I don't think the businesses were generally tagging the ADA. That was simply fell into their design to try and deregulate as much as possible. And of course, we've seen what deregulation does for us with ERCOT. So, we're a little concerned about introducing amendments at this point in time where the Congress might see the opportunity to gut it. And I'm afraid that happens not simply because it's a disability bill, but simply because there are regulations associated with an expectation. So that I don't think you could get the ADA through this particular Congress. Now, a few years ago, I would not have worried about it. I wouldn't have obviously the ADA Amendments Act got passed and signed by the president in 2008. And many would have argued that particular Congress was polarized. But, we were able to get that through. I'll give you an example of a piece that's very important to us that continues to be beat down by the conservatives, and that is the United Nations, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. I actually carried the proposal for that to the United Nations on behalf of Vice President Bush, and that convention was passed by the United Nations, and it has worldwide impact. Now, despite the fact that the United States originally introduced it, the United States has not ever voted to endorse it. And we are not members of that convention. And we have tried and tried to get the Congress to endorse that convention, to be a member of the convention. And conservatives who are not anti-disability, and they're not anti-access for people with disabilities around the world, but they are anti-United Nations. And they won't consider that particular proposal, no matter. I mean, we got Bob Dole actually got out of a hospital bed and went to the floor of the Senate to try and cajole his former colleagues into voting for that, and it failed. So that was about the same time that we got the Congress to pass the amendments to the ADA, and those amendments are quite strident. When you stop and think about the fact that the Congress agreed to regulate discrimination on the basis of genetic history, that's profound. That's major. So, I mean, that occurred in a relatively polarized Congress, and so I'm not averse to the polarity, but right now I think it's extreme. I wouldn't want to test it.
Thank you. One last question. You mentioned autism earlier when you were speaking about less visible disabilities. So we have a question from Amy Krause, who works in the Burkhart Center for Autism here on campus. She asks, what are your thoughts on how we continue to push past the performative support that employers might show towards employment of people with disabilities?
Well, I think it's real important to look at models. And there are some, and you're aware, working in that area, that there are some model employers. One employer that I do consulting with, the Anthem Health Insurance Company, has a marvelous program for recruiting, hiring people with disabilities, including people with autism, including people with mental illness, and including many people with physical impairments and others. So, you know, their program has demonstrated the efficacy of employment for people with autism. And if we can identify these companies and use them to teach as best practices, perhaps other employers will come along. And I do think it's important for us to emphasize the abilities and the extraordinary abilities of people with certain kinds of disabilities. You know, turning the what some people might consider to be deficits into positives. That happens frequently when somebody finds opportunity for folks with disabilities. The other thing I would say is that, and this does not apply to perhaps to people on the spectrum, but it certainly does to other people with disabilities, and that is the benefit of remote work opportunities. And I really think now is the time that we need to emphasize opportunity in the workplace for people with disabilities, because employers are more open than they ever have been to the notion that people can be productive and not necessarily be in an office space. And this, you know, that if you go to an employment interview with a Zoom camera on your face, they don't know what else you look like. So what difference does it make? And the opportunities, I think, are there and expanding. So we just have to build on it now. It simply doesn't occur as quickly as we would like it. There are a number of programs in Texas, and I want to mention Texas Tech, because from time to time, Texas Tech has made some extraordinary contributions. I'm trying to remember exactly the period of time that there was a rehabilitation engineering center at Tech, and the dean of the College of Engineering actually got a grant from, I think it was NSF, and that grant enabled Tech to bring together experts from all over the United States, mostly people with disabilities, to work on new designs, new approaches to accessibility. That report contributed to a lot of legislation that related to people with disabilities. I think that study, that work may have been done in the late 1970s, early 1980s. The Research and Training Center related to disability at Tech has made consistent contributions, and the programs there related to learning disabilities are second to none and leading in the country. So I just need to acknowledge that and to say that you guys need to keep on keeping on.
Thank you, Lex. Thanks for the shout out to Texas Tech. Thank you for this fantastic, wonderful conversation that we've had this afternoon. Also to Bob, again, thank you so much for bringing Lex to us. We really appreciate that. And to Charlotte, Larry, and Brian for their wonderful questions and keeping the conversation going. Before I let everyone go, I want to very quickly share my screen again, if I can, and well, maybe I can't, but let me, yeah, there we are, sorry. Want to share our upcoming Donuts and Diversity events. So very quickly, our next event will be on Tuesday, March 30th, and the topic will be creating inclusive campus spaces. Our very own Liz Karam from management will be moderating, and our panelists are, again, another all-star lineup. So we've got Genevieve Durham de Cicero, Jesse Jow, Suzanne Tapp, and Elisa Wong as panelists. And then wrapping up the series for this spring, on Wednesday, April 21st, Andy's put together a great session on feminism. Why does the word feminism generate so much disdain? And the coordinators of that session are going to be Deidre Popovich from our Department of Marketing and Jocelyn Scott, who is a visiting professor in women's and gender studies. So I wanted to make you aware of those events. Again, thanks everyone for attending today. This has been fantastic. Lex was gracious to share his email earlier. So if you have questions that we didn't get to, please feel free to shoot him an email. He's obviously delighted to continue this conversation offline. And thank you all again for all of your help, and to Julie and to Matthew for the help behind the scenes too, to run the webinar. This has been wonderful. Thank you.